Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Operations. I want to welcome one of our new VIP members. Shelley Davis Boyd is the founder, president, and CEO of SD and Company. Thanks for joining, Shelley. Okay, Brian, let's dive into today's topic, starting off with the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve Market Committee's minutes became available, and this cast some light on intentions regarding interest rates. What did we
Yeah,
learn?
it's interesting that the Federal Reserve in the past has been pretty unified. Right? Normally, you see all of the directors going in one direction or the other. The first thing is that they're not unified. There's different schools of thought, but the idea of either keeping things the same or in the future considering maybe rate hikes, given that the jobs market has ticked up and been a little stronger, and inflation stickier inflation is starting to set in, that the sentiment has definitely moved away from the idea of looking forward to rate cuts by the end of the year to projecting that the situation may warrant fiscal tightening, which means higher interest rates. So definitely not a projection of higher interest rates. I think the status quo um, is probably the most likely outcome. But the statements in the past, the Federal Reserve has made statements when they do the press conference, and you can kind of learn everything you need to know from that. But these days, looking at the minutes is when they become available is a little more telling, and definitely not a unified Federal Reserve, which is in a way is not surprising either, because you do have crosswinds and mixed signals. The economy is not saying definitely do this or definitely do that. So the idea that there would be um, different schools of thought, not particularly surprising, but still one, if I were to bet what's going to happen, I would say for the foreseeable future, status quo.
All right, let's talk about a case before the Michigan Supreme Court. It's actually a tax case, and it's regarding consumers' energy. A recent filing suggested that the outcome might impact rates. How so?
Yeah, it's kind of a complicated case, but it has to do with apportionment. So the way that corporate taxes work in Michigan is that you only pay the tax on your income proportionate to your sales that happen in the state. So for example, if you have a business and 50% of your sales were to people, locations, businesses inside the state of Michigan, then you would only pay the corporate tax rate on, or the income tax rate on 50% of your income. So that's how the apportionment works. But that part is pretty simple. The in the assumption there is that what you're selling in other states, you have to pay them taxes. And so you don't want to essentially penalize people for making things in your state by saying you got to pay taxes here and you got to pay taxes in a different place where you're selling. So Michigan has a very kind of standard um, sales apportionment factor for its business taxes. What's before the state right now is, or before the state Supreme Court with Consumers Energy, is saying, look, if the Consumers Energy actually sells all of its electricity to the regional grid, and then it buys back what it uses in Michigan. And so that's its Michigan sales is based on whatever it buys back to meet the demand in Michigan. And they've done it like this always. Treasury has recently said, no, you the point of sale for all of it, 100% is in the state, even though a lot of that electricity is sold elsewhere, kind of subsidizes the state's electricity users by what they can sell elsewhere. Well, the state's now saying you got to pay income taxes on 100% of it. Now, the way utilities work is that's just part of their rate filing. So if they have to pay higher taxes, then it's just puts in the rate case and then they make it back up in the rates. So it is not a particularly good deal. The state wants more taxes, but at the end of the day, it ultimately gets recovered, by the way, with a rate of return um, through the rate filings in the future. So it's one that you look at a sales apportionment factor for utility company might think, well, it's probably not something that I need to pay attention or worry about. But if you're a big electricity user, you got a pretty big stake in this. And it wouldn't just be if you're consumers, this would be the sort of thing it would set a precedent. It would apply to other places as well.
So, Brian, are there other issues at stake more broadly than rates?
Yeah, in this case, I think the thing that is that caught my attention and makes me want to watch this case a little bit closer is not just the impact that it has on rates, but also how aggressive the state is going to be when it comes to reinterpreting sales apportionment factors. So these days you can make things and sell goods and services from anywhere to anywhere. And the idea that you can live here and sell somewhere else, and you have to file taxes and pay in the places where you're selling. If the state starts getting more aggressive on reinterpreting apportionment laws, especially if the law doesn't change, it's just going to reinterpret it, then it really does create an uncertainty for businesses moving forward. So if the Supreme Court in this case allows the state to apply the income tax, the business income tax, to 100% of their sales, including what is sold out of the state, then it does beg the question, anybody else with sales outside of the state, what do they have at risk? How are they going to be next? Or is there going to be a reinterpretation that applies it beyond electricity? Honestly, I don't know why they would stop at electricity. If the Supreme Court says do it this way here, now the way it's sold, you sell into this grid and where it's made and where it's sold, there are some intricacies that are specific to electricity. But the broader question, I think, is a pretty important one, considering how many things are made in Michigan and sold other places. And that's always been a benefit. You want to make sure that there is not a disincentive to make things here. So if you're going to say to, just give the classic example, an automotive company. If you're going to say to an automotive company, you sell stuff all over the world, but you have to pay 100% of taxes to Michigan, no matter where you're selling, then the incentive would be to not make anything in Michigan. And of course, policymakers aren't going to want that. Hopefully, that's not what the Supreme Court wants either.
All right, let's move on to consumer sentiment. There was a survey that was recently released regarding how consumers are feeling right now. Tell us what we've learned.
Well, the bottom line is everybody feels broke right now. It was kind of striking in this Harris poll that found that 95% of Americans, it's not a typo or like a misstatement. 95% of Americans believe the US is in what the question called an affordability crisis. So it's not just the lower income end of the spectrum. It's not middle. I mean, this is almost everybody saying that we're in an affordability crisis. And about half, this was even more striking, was that about half reported being, a little less than half reported being struggling to pay for groceries and gas. And if you look at gas, obviously is gone up quite a bit, but also food prices really going all the way back to the pandemic. And it just seems like the cost of food has been high and increasing. The other thing that was pretty interesting to me is that these days, when you do crosstabs, look at Republicans, Independents, Democrats in crosstabs, you would think people are living in a different universe. Like these people see it this way, and these people see it that way, and like how are they even seeing and living in the same place or have such different perspectives? But not on this. This actually cuts across the parties. The idea that we are in an affordability crisis, that people are really frustrated, and then 57% are pessimistic, saying that the economy is getting worse. That's up from 46% in the same survey in February. And that's a pretty that's a those are high numbers. I mean, and a lot of times it's like I'll talk about something on here. People don't necessarily have the context. Is that unusual? Is that high? I'm telling you, this is high. These types of numbers. People have been frustrated in the past. That did ebb a bit for a while, and this sentiment is back and it's very strong.
So Americans are concerned about affordability, but the stock market is hitting an all-time high right now. So What's the disconnect between the markets and the economy?
Yeah, it's not, it's one of those areas where it's, um, the stock market itself is very heavily weighted in a very small number of companies in terms of like it can go up when there's only a few dozen companies that are going up and the rest are going down or staying stagnant. So part of it is that is the indexes in the stock market are not necessarily reflective of the entire economy, but I think what's happening here is a level closer to the ground or closer to street level than that even. And it's it's that inflation exceeds income growth now. So if you look at inflation over the last year and you look at income over the last year, income growth is not down or stagnant. It's actually still growing at a pretty normal looking pace, but inflation exceeds it. That means that real wages are declining. And that can happen while the stock market is strong, and that is happening now. And so even though last month, I think that, yeah, what did I put down here? The jobs report, 111,000 jobs, and the in stock market doing well, but that doesn't change the sentiment that people feel when they're losing buying power. And that's that's the crisis. I think when you look at the just kind of generally the mood of people, but also the confidence and the pessimism that has been rising, that you really can trace it back to that even if incomes are rising and even if unemployment is still relatively low, if people are struggling to make ends meet, then they're going to be in a bad mood, and they're going to be more pessimistic, and that's what we see happening.
And all of this very likely will play a role in how people vote. So let's talk about Election Watch 2026, starting off with Mallory McMorrow's exit from the US Senate race and how her exit has dramatically reshaped it. So what's the latest on polling and expectations?
Yeah, there's these two really big races in Michigan. The first one is the primary among Democrats for the United States Senate. So outgoing Senator Gary Peters, as he is retiring. Um, you have this contest that was a three-way race, and McMorrow dropped out, and so you have Haley Stevens and Abdul El Sayed. So these two were running. Now, if you were to look at um, polling just before, let me see here, with McMorrow's name still listed, it was El Sayed in the lead with 41%, Stevens at 38, and McMorrow had really dropped down quite a bit. That's why she exited. That her pathway to winning was evaporating. Now, the first poll that I've seen anyway from Tavern Research showed first after literally neck and neck between El Sayed and Stevens. So 42% Stevens, El Sayed 41%, so margin of error. And if you look at what's happening out there in this race and just the extraordinary amount of effort and spending and attention that the race is getting, you only get that type of activity if there is a real contest there. And so that seems highly credible to me that there is a really neck and neck type of a close race happening there. The margin of error in that poll, by the way, so they were between 1 point either way, and the margin of error is 2.5%. So what's interesting though, here's a factor that's kind of interesting is that early voting had already started before McMorrow dropped out, and it's too late to have her name taken off the ballot. So her name will be on the ballot when people vote, and many people have already voted. Now, by the way, if you're one of those people that have already voted by absentee, you can spoil that ballot. You can contact your clerk. There's a process. It's a sealed ballot, and they can still, until it's unsealed and counted, they can shred it. They can get rid of that ballot, and you could vote again if you wanted to. So there's a process for that, but it is neck and neck. It is very close. I would hate to even predict this one. Republicans do seem to prefer to run against El Sayed in terms of their polling, and it sort of, when you look at the general election matchups and some light polling that has happened, I don't put too much stock in that yet because those are still hypothetical. You can't always tell in hypothetical matchups, but but it will, Mike Rogers, who's a presumptive Republican nominee, it's going to be close either way. Either person that he runs against, whether it's El Sayed or Haley Stevens, I do expect that will be one of the closest races to watch in the whole country.
All right, now let's check in on the Republican primary for governor. Obviously, the primary is less than a month away. We're down to three candidates. President Trump has endorsed one of them. So, how much has that reshaped the race, and what do you see happening from here on out?
So I did there was an internal poll. So John James put out an internal poll that showed him like running away with the Republican nomination to face off against Jocelyn Benson. And I should acknowledge too, Jocelyn Benson has to beat Sheriff Chris Swanson, but polling shows her prohibitively far ahead. So she's a likely nominee there. But the John James internal polls, it was a 25-point lead over Mike Cox and Perry Johnson. I have heard about other kind of daily tracking polling that's happening that shows that it's not that far of a race, that things quickly kind of settled back into a real horse race. Now, if you look at the overall spending, it's one of the things that I look at in races. You got polls, and they mean something, but I also look at, do candidates really believe they can win? So there's what they say, and then it's what they spend. And if you still see a high amount of spending, then usually it's not a vanity spend. Like they really think they can win. So I see Mike Cox and Perry Johnson still going after it. That means that they believe that they have some sort of pathway, potentially, even if it's a long shot, that there's some sort of pathway they believe is real, where they're continuing to move forward. So I do sort of expect that one to be. You have to believe that John James is the favorite to win, but the idea that it's not a gimme, I find also believable, again, based on candidate behavior. So it's been a fascinating cycle throughout the entire this entire time, and this is just the primary. By the time the general election starts, you can add 148 state legislative races and every congressional race as well. And there's a handful of those that will be likely marquee national races to watch. So definitely a political hotbed in our state this year, and something that of course we will continue to closely monitor.
All right, well, that is all the show that we have for you today. We hope you have a great week, and we will see you back here next Monday at 3 o'clock.
See you next time, everybody.